Our speaker, Kerry Brown, is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College in London. He's an Associate of Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House in London. And from 2012 to 2015, he was Professor of Chinese Politics and Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney in Australia. Prior to this, he worked at Chatham House from 2006 to 2012 as Senior Fellow and then Head of the Asia Programme. From 1998 to 2005, he worked at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office as First Secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing, and then as Head of the Indonesia, Philippine and East Timor section. He previously graduated from Cambridge University and has a PhD in Chinese politics and language from Leeds University. He is the author of almost 20 books on modern Chinese politics, among them the latest that he published on China, which I really strongly recommend as I'm a great reader of his books. He has recently been awarded the China Cultural Exchange Person of the Year. And together with Professor Brown, we will tackle the CPC's storytelling in the new era topic. And so from this moment on, I will just leave the floor to Professor Brown. And later on, for any question you might have, please write me in my private chat so that I can collect all the questions and then forward them to Professor Brown. So please just write them privately to me. So not in the chat, in the global chat, but just in my private chat, so it's easier for me to collect them. Thank you so much, and please, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to this event. So I think the idea is I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion and to hear your views. And I'm grateful for the organisers today for organising this event on a Saturday morning. So I do appreciate everyone being able to come. And I know that you're based across Europe, but also in other places, so there must be some time differences. The title of, kind of storytelling is important because in the ways in which the kind of leadership with a capital L under Xi Jinping since 2012, the way that they've spoken, I think has been very deliberately different. I do remember in around about 2010, attending meetings with the International Liaison Department with a group of European and American scholars. I think it was David Schamberg was the person organizing it. And one of the questions was, how do we speak to the world? The party officials were asking this. There was an official from Xinhua, the official news agency, who was talking about, the fact that there were lots of negative messages and negative stories about China, particularly around the time of the Olympics in 2008. And then a kind of strong desire to try and change this. And I think those sorts of conversations and many others that were being held at the same time did reach a conclusion that the party needed to change its language and officials needed to speak in a different way. It's been a common complaint of Chinese officials for a long time that there's this sort of party language, the Guanhua, the bureaucratic language, the sort of way that cadres speak, and it's disconnected to the sort of natural language of, the Chinese street language, if you want to call it that. Mao Zedong in the 1940s, I think, wrote an essay about, kind of the party style, the language of party officials was often disengaging. It needed to be warmer, it needed to be more urgent, and really kind of more attuned to people's daily needs. And in the Cultural Revolution from 1966, there was this sort of invasion of sharp, sometimes quite shocking language into official language, almost like a kind of language rebellion. But even in the 1970s and 80s, as reform started, there was more of an attempt to bridge the gap between the world of politics, the world of business, the world of society. this kind of bias of the party to use a particular technocratic kind of language of managerial dictation and sort of calmness and no real attempt to kind of convey emotion. It became once more the default. And in many ways, in the period of Hu Jintao from 2002, you can really see this big disconnect between the language that the party used, at least its top level officials, conveying important messages it wanted society to receive, but speaking to a society which was really in ferment and going through huge changes where every day, there were kind of transformations. And, this kind of carnival period, I think the Russian philosopher Bakhtin talks of, the carnival sense of life, the idea of diversity and energy and all sorts of, kind of interesting and new changes. This was something the party language, particularly under Hu Jintao as its main spokesperson, definitely didn't represent. It definitely didn't represent. And I suppose when we look at the kind of key statements of the 2000s, we kind of really, see the peak of this. Hu Jintao, I think in 2007, the Congress that year produced this long but disengaging and kind of droning, repetitive, technocratic kind of language, which really didn't tell a story at all and was hard to kind of work out. You wouldn't have been able to look at this speech and say, well, what were the key points he was trying to convey? And I suppose when we see the very first moments of Xi Jinping's leadership, I remember at the time I was sitting in a lobby of a Beijing, I think it was the Shangri-La Hotel, the Kerry Center Hotel, I think it's called now, at the moment, about 11:30, when the new Politburo emerged on the 15th of November 2012. And I just remember that Xi Jinping made a fairly short statement. One of the things he said, you can find it easily on the internet, is the narrowing the gap between party and the people. This was one of the key things, that in the recent years, there's an admission that the party and the people had grown distant from each other. Now, one of the kind of questions I've always been asking myself is, what do politicians do? What are politicians? Now, in the Chinese context, bureaucratic politicians, so they have careers, they have training. They're not like politicians, I suppose, in the West, who tend to have more diverse backgrounds and tend to often just accidentally fall into politics. It's not something that they necessarily start out their lives doing. Whereas in China, I think on the whole, politicians enter politics. It's the only thing they can do. That, if you want to do politics in China, organized politics, you must be a member of the party that has a monopoly on this. And so you go through a very structured training through party schools and through ideological training. And therefore, it sort of seemed quite interesting that, what went beyond administering and kind of managing, what do politicians do in China? What do they add? I mean, how are they different from pure bureaucrats in the Western system? I mean, I think there's many ways in which they kind of are meant to convey particular messages. I think it's clear that they must be disseminators of core messages. And in that sense, they are storytellers. I think Max Weber, the sociologist, the great German sociologist, said, politicians basically are warlords or magicians. And what that means is that if they're magicians, they do amazing things that people didn't think you could do. They kind of, basically create from nothing opportunities, or they use force. And I think we're seeing a kind of period in which, Xi Jinping, in a sense, is like the magician. But the magic is done through telling these particular stories that are transformative and trying to basically craft a national narrative. So if we do accept that we're in the era of the storytellers, then we have to really pay attention to the story that they're telling. What is that story about? One thing that I think is striking is that this is a story which is driven by a very strong narrative of necessity and destiny. There's always been language of historic mission. Hu Jintao talked about the historic mission of the party as the hero. In Greek mythology, there's always a sort of idea of the hero who can go through turmoil and be transformed. And in some ways, the key player in this whole narrative is not Xi or any particular leader, it's the party as a kind of corporate body. It is the hero. It's the thing that has collectively suffered and is now on the moment of kind of salvation and renaissance and rejuvenation. The language of rejuvenation has been used intensively over the last decade. If you look all over the place, from the long speech that Xi Jinping gave at the 19th Party Congress almost 5 years ago, to the official party history, which was issued only this April, the first one really since 1981. If you look at all sorts of other statements that Xi and leaders around him have made, renaissance is, a kind of key word, rejuvenation, rebirth, renewal. Now, this kind of gives a sort of sense that the era that we're in, the new era, as it's been called in the last 4 years, is a moment of culmination, a kind of narrative highlight or peak. It is the culmination of a story of a kind of nation led by the party as the hero that is bringing China to its moment of kind of modernization on its own terms. It is the realization of a much older story of creating a China which is a great, rich, strong country. And that story goes back many, many decades, indeed, to the end of the Qing dynasty, when reformers like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao promoted this idea of the strong, rich country that could stand up and face opposition, not be colonized, not be bullied. All of these things, which of course have been adorned by the sense of, China, kind of suffering from a history of colonization and being insulted, being bullied. And now in 2021, the centenary of the Communist Party, very important moment. Symbolically, this story kind of is truly transformative. It shows that this is different. This moment now is one where the party realizes its destiny. That narrative is, I think, driven by this sense of history being a kind of ever forward-going, ever purposeful, meaningful progress. It's not cyclical. It's not kind of like the rise and fall. It's not about the party now being good and maybe in 10 years' time being no good. It is about trying to get to a sort of perpetual, happy, almost utopian state. That, in a sense, is nothing more than a continuation of the Mao Zedong sort of utopianism. Mao's vision during the Cultural Revolution, despite the catastrophic social and practical outcomes of that 10 years of social mobilization and political turmoil, was largely a utopian one. And that's probably the most tragic thing about it, that the intentions were, on the whole, very idealistic. You could argue, therefore, that one of the problems of the Xi Jinping era is this kind of bias towards idealism and to being sort of guided by the same utopianism that existed in the past and which had such a catastrophic outcome. When we look at the 19th Party Congress, basically 3.5 hour speech that Xi Jinping made, the final quarter of it is all about promises about building the better life. In November 2012, Xi Jinping talked about constructing the beautiful lives of Chinese people. The party telling a story of beauty is obviously something that outsiders find very strange, and that's one of the causes of this big disconnect between Western, European and American understandings of what's happening in China and the way it looks within. most people, when you look at discourse in Western media and politics, do not think of the Communist Party of China and what it's doing as remotely beautiful. And they certainly have this idea that Chinese lives under this regime are not beautiful. But the party is insistent that that's exactly what it's doing. And the society that it presides over is giving much more complex kind of statements, which are hard to really make a conclusion on. It doesn't seem like society in China, when we listen to particular voices, is saying that they're crazy about Marxism, Leninism, and they probably are not willing to say a great deal about their true opinions of Xi Jinping thought. But it's also pretty clear that people are keen on having material lives which are of the same standard or even better than in the West, that they want a clean environment, good social welfare, good healthcare, they want opportunities, and they want enrichment. And so the complexity, I suppose, comes from the way in which the story of the party is, in a sense, delivering these things, even though it's couched in a language which still has the outward dressings of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Xi Jinping thought, and all the other ideologies. The story is important for Xi Jinping too, because of the fact that it creates an emotional bond. And emotion in Chinese politics is a tricky thing. In the past, emotions, when they were mobilized, often led to very unpredictable outcomes. We could say that the peak of modern Chinese emotional history was the Cultural Revolution. If you were to write a history of the emotions of modern China, you would say that the peak was probably during parts of the Cultural Revolution. This kind of intense emotionism, as we can understand now, led to really, really complicated social outcomes. I mean, we can look at the particular stories of the Cultural Revolution that have been issued by individuals, by groups. Andrew Walder at Stanford has done lots of work on this. Many other scholars, Covid Meskels has done lots of work on this. They can testify to very tragic outcomes of the Cultural Revolution. And yet it's also hard not to be struck by the intense emotions that the Cultural Revolution gave rise to. I mean, this is pretty obvious when we look at the kind of language of the Cultural Revolution. One of the most famous is the testimony of a young Red Guard when they sort of caught sight of Mao Zedong in 1966 during one of the great rallies that year, in which they talk in an almost ecstatic way, seeing Xi and seeing Mao and being kind of overwhelmed by the vision of Mao. And indeed, if you look at the official history of the Communist Party issued this April, a quarter of which looks at the period of Xi Jinping, you get a similar intensity of emotion when that period is first alluded to. Language almost dissolves into a kind of praise, ecstasy, almost like an orgasm. It's quite extraordinary how powerful this kind of, overwhelming emotion is. And that way you can say that though I'm sure Chinese leaders, contemporary leaders, are very aware of the dangers of inspiring too much public emotion, they also see the very real need to engage those emotions. In around about 2011, I remember talking to a German politician and asking about his relationships and kind of discussions with the then very popular leader of Bo Xilai, who was the party secretary of Chongqing in southwestern China. Bo had attracted international attention by rousing up public emotion through red song campaigns and by gathering up public support for a very big clampdown on local mafia. Both of these things were highly criticized in the Western media, and yet both were extremely popular locally. When I visited Chongqing, many years after Bo was removed from power and expelled from the party for corruption and his involvement through his wife in the murder of a British businessman, who I also vaguely knew, Neil Haywood, I remember talking to a local person. I think they were working in a hotel, and saying, what do you remember about Bo Xilai? And the person saying that they missed him. This was not an unusual view. People did have a high regard for him as a local leader. Bo, I remember the German politician saying, was the only politician of his generation at that time who did the emotional kind of stuff with the public, who tried to speak to them in an emotional and engaging way, and who tried to create a connection between the worlds of politics and that of the public. Remember how incredibly remote the world of Chinese politics is. You may well, from your jobs or your study, have gone into it. You may remember visits to particular privileged places in the Chinese political world. Those strange moments when you're whisked in cars from the busy streets in Beijing or elsewhere into the leadership compounds in the middle, where there is a stillness and quietness. And when you're ushered into huge, very ornate rooms with great bouquets of flower and kind of seats where you sit, you have servants serving you tea, and you meet the leader, whoever that leader is. I remember this over the last 30 years, going into these places and always being slightly disorientated by going from such chaos outside to these kind of beautiful, still gardens, well manicured, almost like a kind of fairy tale where you don't see anyone do anything. You just happen to arrive and these leaders mysteriously appear from behind screens. It's not surprising that these places are very, very hard, even for foreigners, to get into with their privileged access if they're diplomats or working in political areas. For locals, they're almost completely inaccessible. Another country. And yet, these are the places, of course, from which leaders speak and which they have to somehow make a connection. And it would be disastrous for politicians to get too comfortable in these remote places. In the past, emperors famously could completely disappear. 500 years ago, during the Ming Dynasty, the Wang Li emperor, completely disengaged from his officials and only dealing with his eunuchs, held no official meetings for 20 years. There's a haunting story of the great Jesuit missionary, Matteo Ricci, finally meeting the emperor. In fact, in the 1600s, when he did, in inverted commas, meet the emperor, all he did was go in front of an empty chair on which the emperor should have sat, bowed down, and symbolically met the emperor. Wan Li had not physically met any visiting dignitaries or any other officials for many decades. He wasn't going to do so till his death after nearly 45 years in power. The empty throne is a haunting metaphor. Chinese leaders do not want to have the empty throne. But it may well be that if they use the language of kind of officialdom, in which they use a disengaged, emotionally alienating language, empty throne is exactly what they will be sitting on. It's therefore striking that in the era of Xi Jinping, there has been so much effort to go amongst the people. The strange story, which was never truly proved or disproved, about the time in which he came to power, in which a taxi driver, somewhat bemused, picked up a man who, in his words, looked like the party secretary, Xi Jinping, and another official from near Zhongnanhai, and in which they had a strange conversation in which the man who looks like Xi was talking about the problems of smog in Beijing, but how on earth you did anything about it when the public wanted such huge effort made on cleaning up the environment. As the taxi driver somewhat comically said, he didn't sound like a very, very run-of-the-mill normal person. A few weeks later, Xi Jinping did, in fact, and this is a true story, appear in a little eatery in Beijing where he is pictured. You can find these images on the internet, simply having buns, kind of meat buns, and having a simple meal. This effort for him to be like those amongst the people has been reinforced by the most important narrative that he has been promoting or been promoted by his propagandists, of him being the man who suffered in the past when he was a sent-down youth for 7 years from the late 1960s in the Cultural Revolution and lived in remote Shanxi province in the great revolutionary region of Yan'an. looking at a kind of series of recollections of this time that I came across recently, I was just struck by the constant insistence on him, Xi, being an individual who ate bitterness. He can really eat bitterness. And this, I suppose, is meant to bestow a kind of authenticity on what he does today. He is, as I think Lee Kuan Yew, the Singaporean late leader, said, China's or Asia's Nelson Mandela, a man who's been through suffering and therefore knows what it is to prevail. All of this, of course, could be dismissed. But I think in conclusion, I'd say that we should never, ever underestimate the power of stories. Stories do things that simple kind of facts don't. Make America Great Again was enough to get a very, very unlikely president into the White House, at least for 4 years in America. Take back control was enough to convince my fellow compatriots in Britain that it was okay to have petrol shortages and other shortages because at least we had restored sovereignty to Great Britain. Your personal interests could be very, very clear, but stories can say something about why you should do things maybe against them. I would therefore say in conclusion that you need to pay attention to this story, because it seems to me that this story is gearing up to tell Chinese people that their time of making different sorts of sacrifices is imminent. This is not, of course, a period of actual war, but it is a period in which the Xi leadership's internal discourse and narrative is definitely at odds with what the world outside wants to hear. That was probably always going to happen. When was it ever likely that a communist country becoming the world's biggest economy was going to be something that the rest of the world would be very happy or be able to deal well with? The problem with the Xi leadership is that it is so clear. It does not give ambiguity. It is saying very distinctly a number of really unsettling messages for outsiders in particular. That no, China will not be a nice, neat, liberal democracy and join the rest. That no, China will not sit according to the rules of others in its own territory and just be a passive observer. That no, China will not put its story on hold because it doesn't suit Western narratives. These are things that we have to deal with, and it means that I suspect the greatest challenge for us in the future is, firstly, we have to listen to that story, but secondly, we have to create a radically different one about what we're listening to for ourselves. And I would say at the moment that it is really, really clear that in terms of storytelling, the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people are somewhat ahead of the rest of the world in the story that they are creating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that I can speak for everybody here in this room when I tell you that it's been an exceptionally incredible lecture, and you have touched so many topics so that I try to take notes, and I have a paper full of notes right now that I will try to organize all together just to arrive to some of the questions that I have, because while we were talking, of course, I started receiving a lot of questions in the chat, because of course, when you have so many fruitful thoughts, questions will just come out naturally. Well, you touched so many topics, and trying to just gather them in big categories. You talked about the difficulties that many people have in trying to understand China and trying to have contacts with China. Why? Because most of the time we don't know much about this country. We don't know much about the history, the narrative of this country, and yet we try to understand it, but not using the tools that are right and proper to understand this country correctly. So we tend to underestimate it or not particularly understand it. So what happens is that most of the time you talked about narratives used in a very difficult and period of Chinese history, which has been Cultural Revolution. And now and then, I can try to say in academic work, at least here in Italy, we try to overlap the Cultural Revolution kind of narrative to things happening today. I've read it in in the last attempt to the introduction of the Xi Jinping thought in schools, and people just went straight forward to trying to overlapping it to the Cultural Revolution, but also you stressed out that it's not the best thing to do to overlap these things together, because you know that the narrative use is completely different. And what also you try to convey with your message is this attempt, and strong and consistent attempt of the Chinese Communist Party of not being overlapped to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a very important personality, but is not the only person in the Communist Party of China. And the Communist Party of China has been striving to narrow the space between the party and the people, both with the kind of history and narrative that they've been using, but also with the tools that they had in store. And that comes my question. Sorry for taking this long lead, but just wanted to try to collect all the topics that you gathered. And so I was thinking about a kind of storytelling 2.0, because Communist Party of China has tried to reach people in the country, also using some more advanced technologies, just like APPS. So I'm thinking about 学习全国. So among the most famous that they have created. Do you think that it has been a kind of successful experiment? Because from my point of view, at least this shows a great attention to the desire to be enjoyable and easily reachable for the people in the country, which is, I think, fundamental for a narrative. Because another thing to understand is that you always put a difference between the internal communication and the external one. So on the internal side. So please, and while in the meanwhile, I will gather all the questions that I have in the chat.
Yeah, sure. So does sort of social media and technology help or create problems for the party? Is that right? I mean, is that the sort of key question? Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think from today you can say that it's been quite a big assistance. You know, I mean, this is a techno dictatorship. I think that's why it's different from, you know, Mao or previous periods. I mean, we don't know what, you know, Mao Zedong's kind of leadership would have looked like with the kinds of technology that only exist today. It would have been quite a sort of extraordinary thing, I think, you know, kind of to have the sorts of potency of Mao's message and his ideology with, you know, the technology, the social media. You know, in many ways, the Cultural Revolution kind of tried to do the dissemination of messages through stenciled pamphlets and things like this. I mean, I've got piles of them, you know, myself, and people collect these things. You know, they must have produced billions of these. You know, well, what would you have been able to achieve if you could just do the Cultural Revolution by tweet or Weibo or Weixin or something like that? But I don't know. I mean, you know, the assumption, which was extremely wrong 25 years ago when media and internet appeared, was this would be a threat for the party, and it's been tamed. You know, Fang Bingxing, the creator of the Great Firewall of China, he's sort of solved this issue of how you completely control the way that you can message social media in China. Whether in the end people believe, I mean, that's an interesting question. What do people believe anyway? You know, what do they fervently believe? What does it mean to believe? I mean, we read every day all sorts of stuff. We, you know, believe it. What does it mean to say that we believe particular things? I mean, believing a scientific fact like 1 + 1 = 2 doesn't create the same fervor as believing, if you do, that, you know, vaccinating yourself makes you safer, or the opposite. So the interesting thing is belief and emotion. That's the really kind of interesting area. And if you think emotions, they're not, you know, they're not sort of bubbling up kind of unverbal things. They are intimately linked to how you speak, and their judgments and evaluations. I think I really do believe that they're very intellectual. And so, you know, kind of the way that the party sort of creates different sorts of message is very, very complex because of the social media evidence it's given. We could talk about this all day. I mean, this is an extremely complex area, but where it has most fervent commitment from its audience is where the party message aligns with the great nation narrative. You talk about 学习强国, you know, I mean, this is really in the area. If you say the party's mission is to create a powerful, strong country, you created the bridge because people will definitely want a powerful, strong country. And if the party leads to that, well, okay, the party can be part of it. And I think the party has bolted these two together. You will not get the great country without the party being the strategic body that delivers that. And to unpick that organizationally and intellectually, I mean, it's difficult. If you take the party out of that great nation story, you create a lot of risk and problems because, alas, you know, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, the party is absolutely central at the moment to being able to deliver that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. Also, this is a topic that really interests me, and I read a lot of it because I think also that not only the message is conveyed, but also the instrument that you use tells a lot about the kind of commitment that a certain party wants to have in delivering a story. And so we have a lot of questions. I will try to gather some all together so that we can have just one question. So let's start with Jasper, who was thanking you so much for the wonderful talk again. And he asked, like you mentioned, the rest of the world is not very much attracted to China's story. To what extent would you say the Chinese leadership, I mean, I think the CPC is intending, is bothered about this, if it bothers it or him or not?
I mean, broadly, I mean, I think that they are bothered. I mean, I think that they have put a lot of effort into trying to speak to the world, and that's not worked. I mean, I think that they are probably less. I mean, I think they're bothered because it's not great to have so many countries irritated at you. If you look at Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, his speech to a Taiwanese conference, I think it was yesterday or the day before, you know, I mean, it's pretty strong. I mean, the kind of condemnation of China and its kind of global, you know, role and opposition to it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is great for Beijing to have this. But I mean, that doesn't mean that they're going to compromise on what they think is their national interest, and that is to continue to be very sort of assertive, particularly about, you know, kind of domestic issues, and also to not look as though they are taking orders from Washington or elsewhere. So it's kind of a quandary because Beijing probably does know that it doesn't want to have these verbal fights with people. But also it's dealing with, in Washington and sometimes in Europe, you know, governments that are definitely speaking about it in a way which then makes it respond in the way it does. So it's a kind of, you know, it's a sort of, it's a trap. I think everyone's trapped in this language. In the past, the party did make efforts to create different sort of narratives. I think we could say that they have been largely unsuccessful. Western audiences have not embraced those. I think that's partly because Western audiences find the way that China speaks very unfamiliar, and they find the fact that China's speaking unfamiliar. I don't think it's because they have any particular kind of prejudice. It's just that it's a lack of knowledge, because China is a new speaker. I think finally, we have to be aware that the overwhelming convention of media stories, in particular in Western language media, is either going to be about economic benefits from China or economic opportunities from China, or about China being a huge human rights problem. And there's not much in the middle. If you try and speak in the middle, it's always going to be difficult because those two stories are very entrenched. In 30 years of dealing with China, I think that's always been the stories that I've dealt with. China's economic benefits or its human rights problems. And I don't think that those stories are fit for purpose anymore. They are too simple. They just don't work.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now, just staying on the side of the external kind of communication, we have a question that actually gathers so many others that we received from Ilaria Tassari, who is the Vice President of European Guangxi and one of the co-founders, about the kind of external communication that the CPC has tried to convey in the last years. And while many forecasted a shift in Chinese diplomatic approach, often named the wolf warrior diplomacy, so a change to become softer in a way, the language used more recently by party officials, as well as the perception of the party's story, has not changed much. Inaria, I wanted to ask you, is this a failure in addressing the tension produced by officials' aggressive statements, or merely an effort to convince real and potential partners outside China's borders that the country is changing its posture and attitude when it comes to foreign policy? So about this change, yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the posture of those that are closer to China is that they have to be more ambiguous, because they may understand far better than anyone else the complexities and problems of China. Vietnam, Japan, you know, in particular, they have been dealing with China for thousands of years. I mean, sort of hundreds at least. So I don't think they have any illusions. And South Korea, of course. But they also understand that having huge fights with such a powerful, big, economically important neighbor right next to them puts them in an incredibly difficult position. So they are interested in balancing relationships between America and others, but they are also interested in maintaining at least some stability, because they will be on the front line if anything goes wrong. That includes Taiwan too, a different case. Now, the wolf warrior phenomenon, which has been spoken about, is you know, particular individuals who have been like Zhao Lijia and people like this. It is not dissimilar to the kind of language that has been used about issues in the past. I remember in the early 1990s, whenever you got Chinese officials talking about Hong Kong, they were talking in a very inflammatory and angry way. If you look at language that Chinese officials produced in the hard years of the Cultural Revolution, it's also extremely offensive sometimes. So this is an old tradition of invective with Chinese characteristics. Does it mean anything huge about the way China speaks to the world? Well, I mean, it kind of shows the sort of process of mimicry. I think when you see social media produced by officials in America and elsewhere, in particular one official, the president at the time, Trump, then it triggered this incredible response. So, I mean, it's sort of like an echo. I wonder if we were to create a different and more sophisticated language to talk about China publicly in Western discourse politically, whether we wouldn't then create problems for China, because it would have to kind of talk in a similar way back. I don't think, I mean, Xi Jinping certainly made comments about the need for friendlier and more civil discourse. So I think this is not an area that is the default in China. I think it isn't something we should consider as a new normal. It is a phase, and I hope that there's a better way of talking to each other. Maybe the environmental kind of dialogue that's coming up might be one way of trying to do that.
Thank you so much, Professor. And then the following one is from Conor Nolan, the Deputy Secretary General of European Guangxi, and he will ask it directly to you. So, Conor, if you please want to turn your...
Yeah, I can't turn on the camera because of my internet connection, unfortunately, but thank you, Alessia, and thank you, Kerry. It was an amazing presentation and amazing thought points. It's very thought-provoking, especially discussions of emotion, and that's basically what my question will probably get towards. I'll try to be brief and conscious of time. So essentially, it actually leads very well from that last question about wolf warrior diplomacy, because in the question, in my mind anyway, was much more externally and what do other countries think? And I guess that's a topic in and of itself that we could discuss for a whole day. But I want to take that internally, because I feel a lot of the wolf warrior diplomacy or Chinese rhetoric is also, you're speaking to two sides. You're speaking to the domestic and you're speaking to the external. So we hear one thing in the West, but the people within China are hearing the other thing, and they're hearing the strong China defending China's interests. And this has been stoked up over time by the Chinese government. In particular, the use of bluster, whether it's with regards to Taiwan or the South China Sea, it's threats that are quite vague and that help to keep that nationalist support. So it's that sort of storytelling that there might not be action, but the Chinese government is trying to keep both sides at bay. So it's trying to keep its relationships externally while also trying to keep its citizens happy and making sure that they're fighting for the interests they purport to represent. And I think in particular, Rana Mitter in one of his books wrote about the changing discourse around nationalism in China, but in terms of how nationalism is stoked in schools, and that kind of change in the storytelling from the sort of emphasis placed on humiliation to, for example, World War II, and the emphasis placed on China's role as an ally in World War II, and that pride. So there's a new avenue for expressing pride in China that doesn't stem from, or pride in China that stems sort of to wanting the status of China to be up with the US, but in a sense that's built on the accomplishments of China rather than its rightful place that it's been humiliated and it deserves to return to that. So I was just wondering what you thought in terms of, especially in how that plays into the emotion, but how that plays going forward for the CPC, and how it can, in stoking this sort of deeply rooted nationalism, how it can balance those things externally and internally, and it doesn't implode, so to speak. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, the issue of how this sort of nationalistic language and then the emotions associated with it could kind of sometimes get out of control is something people have thought about. I mean, in the Japan, China, I think there was a football match in 2005, and then there was this sort of enormous kind of public demonstrations when China, I think, lost, and that always sort of comes and goes. I remember doing the Belgrade embassy's bombing in 1999. I remember there were huge demonstrations in Beijing, and the British and American embassy were sort of semi-attacked. And you know, in the Cultural Revolution, the British mission, it wasn't an embassy then, the mission, I think in 1967 was sacked, and these things can get out of control. I mean, the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 is the classic example of how, you know, when foreigners get dragged into local issues and, you know, there's kind of strong feelings, they can be blamed for everything. One of the interesting things is how much you get this kind of sense of, you know, throughout Europeans' descriptions, even the Jesuits in the 18th century, 17th century, you know, the idea that foreigners were often kind of blamed for a lot of things. They had a particular sort of, kind of privileged role in some ways. They were regarded as being bringers of particular things that were beneficial, but they're also regarded as being pernicious and untrustworthy. You know, that's never really gone away. The party at the moment is in control of the narrative, I think, of nationalism. But I mean, there are sorts of places, particularly around Taiwan, where you can imagine the logic of this within China would lead to places that would be deeply problematic for the outside world. The bottom line is that there's no downside to being very nationalistic when you're speaking in China. I mean, it's always a good platform. But the better that language sounds domestically, the worse it is to the outside world. And so it's a question of where you place the balance. I think at the moment we would say that the leadership clearly are privileging domestic. I mean, it's like dual circulation, but in language, right? I mean, they're kind of trying to use two different tones. And it's going to be quite challenging to maintain that. It's an unsteady balance. So I think it's not nationalism in China is an unknown force. We don't really know historically where it leads. We do Japan, for instance, and it wasn't a very good place. That doesn't mean we should be complacent about it, but I suspect that it sounds worse than it is, because I think the Chinese nation state is so much more complicated and questionable than, for instance, Japan, which has a kind of coherence that is much more self-evident. So I suspect that this nationalism within itself has a lot of fractures and fragments, which mean that it will not be the kind of huge unifying force that, for instance, nationalism in Japan proved in the middle of the last century. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And unfortunately, we need to start to say brief, so I will just gather together two questions all together, both from Lau Vicente and Malvina Montini. I'm so sorry for all the others who set their questions. You can try to just send them over, and we will try to reach for Professor Brown. He will be available. And so Raul was wondering whether this change in the internal storytelling is also, giving an impact on the way in which the CPC appears externally. So if this is influencing, if the new internal storytelling is influencing in a way or another the external relations or the external posture of the Communist Party of China. And together with that, since Malvina was asking about the internal struggle of the CPCs between the Red Princes and the other faction of the between all the factions inside the CPCs, whether also this kind of struggle is linked to the posture that they have to the external narrative, or if they are completely separate.
Yeah, the sort of second question, so if you believe in factions and you believe, so say there are different sorts of views and groups within the Communist Party, which is most likely because it's a huge organization. I guess some of them are going to be much more pro engagement with the world than others. That's true of political organizations throughout the world. So, I think Xi Jinping has a fairly consistent view that, the world matters, but on China's terms. That's sort of, that's pretty self-evident. And, the ways in which the party frames the outside world is, I think, largely through self-interest. The outside world matters because you kind of have to work with it because China doesn't exist in its own planet. But I don't think there's any sort of deep desire for a bond beyond that. If there was, China would have made much greater effort to change its distinctiveness, its political system and things like that. So I sometimes feel that it maintains this political system because it makes it different, and China wants to very much believe it's different and is insistent on that. And a lot of its stories, it's sort of always saying about this is a very kind of Chinese style story. Is the narrative structure of Chinese stories radically different from the stories that you get elsewhere in the world? I suspect not. I think those are universal. But certainly the kind of ways in which it tells those stories and the weight it gives to particular kind of things, that is different. If you want to look at that, you just compare the great classic novel, The Story of the Stone, the Hong Lo Meng, with, maybe Tolstoy's War and Peace, and they have completely different narrative structures. But they do have a kind of narrative structure. That's pretty clear. It's just that they do things in a very, very different sort of way. So I think we're going to have to be quite culturally attuned to that as we go forward. We are going to have to know much, much more in order to interpret these stories about the circumstances of their production and the kind of cultural background that they come from in China, which is why a group of people like you are important, because you're obviously thinking a lot about that and engage with that and are potentially interpreters in a kind of period in which I think interpretation is crucial, and misinterpretation could be extremely damaging and extremely destructive.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Also, there are a lot of different moods towards the Dream of the Red Chamber, but personally, I'm a great fan of this book because I think it reveals a lot about the way in which in which China delivered a story, and this is really revealing as a book. And I kindly and really strongly suggest to all the people here in the public who hasn't read it to read it as soon as possible, because it's long, but I mean, for me, it's a beautiful story and reveals a lot about the way in which they conceive communication and telling a story. So on these lines, I thank you so much, Professor, for all the insightful points and topics, and also the lecture that you delivered has been incredible and really amazing for us to listen to. I thank also the public who followed us through all these various and different, and also going very into and deep into the topic that Professor Kerry Brown has tackled. So I invite you all to stay updated and tune to our next events and next activities. I thank so much again, Professor Kerry Brown, for the time that he has given us. And I hope to see you all soon again. So thank you so much and have a nice Saturday.